University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event hosted by the director of the School of Historical Studies, Professor Miri Schäfer-Mosenson, and the Rouben Forum at Tel Aviv University. And it is my huge pleasure really to welcome our speaker today, Professor Nансי Sinkoff, who I had the opportunity to get to know as a student at Rutgers University. Nансי will be discussing her new book, which indeed just came out at Wayne University Press in 2020. The book is titled From Left to Right, Lucy S. Dawidowicz, the New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History. And it is really the first comprehensive biography of Dawidowicz, which was a pioneer historian in the field that we now call Holocaust studies. She was also really a household name in the post-war years. Her work has been translated to Hebrew as well, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with her book, The War Against the Jews, in Hebrew, המלחמה נגד היהודים. So really a household name in the post-war years. And it was not only because of her scholarship on Eastern European Jewry, but also due to her political views. And Nансי Sinkoff argues in the book that Dawidowicz shift from left to right really stemmed from her life experiences, right? She had this amazing research trip traveling to pre-war Poland, spending time in Vilna in 1938. Then she watched the Holocaust unfold from New York, and then she worked with Jewish refugees in post-war Germany. So all of these experiences influenced her shift from the left. She started as a communist, she ended up a neoconservative, from the left to the right. So the book is based on 45 archival collections. Wow, amazing. And it explores her life as a window onto major events and issues of 20th century Jewish life. It connects the American diaspora to the European heartland and also to the modern state of Israel. So it's of interest to American historians, to historians of Eastern Europe, and also those who are interested in Holocaust studies. So many different trajectories. I hope it would be of interest to everyone who's here. So many of you, great to see all of you. Thank you for coming. Nансי Sinkoff is a professor of Jewish studies and history. She's also the academic director of the Blinder Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the United States. Her book includes, among others, the work titled Out of the Shtetl, Making Jews Modern in the Polish Borderland, which had just been reissued in digital format this year by Brown Judaic Studies. And Professor Sinkoff is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including those by the Mellon Foundation, the Fulbright Association, the ACLS, the National Foundation for Jewish Culture, and the USC Shoah Foundation. We just registered for the database, Nансy. You know, our library finally got the database. And she was also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University. So Nансy, we are so pleased to have you here with us today at Tel Aviv University, at least on Zoom. There is no reality anymore, right? Like we just on Zoom from here to eternity. And the title of the talk, which we are very much looking forward to hearing, is Writing a Life in History, Lucy S. Dawidowicz. And of course, this is a Zoom event, so you are all familiar by now with this medium and its benefits. And please do your best to remain mute throughout the lecture, and then we will have time for questions. We will start with a 30 minutes presentation of the book by Nансy. Then Miri and I might ask a few questions just to start off the discussion, but we will then have a full Q&A session with this wonderful audience. So it is now my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Nансי Sinkoff. The floor is yours.
תודה רבה. אז כן, אנחנו נעבור לאנגלית, אבל רציתי להגיד כמה מילים בעברית. תודה רבה לכם. אני מאוד שמחה להשתתף, ורק קצת עצובה שאנחנו לא יושבים ביחד סביב שולחן עם קפה טוב, ומקווה שיהיה הזדמנות בעתיד, אבל מי יודע, אנחנו ממש בזמנים מאוד מוזרים. ומיוחד אני רוצה להודות למיכל שפירא, וגם לפרופסור שפר מוזנסון שהזמינו אותי לתת את ההרצאה. Okay, we'll go back to English. Thank you very, very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen, which has images from the book, and I will try to speak both succinctly and swiftly because there's a lot to cover. And I just want to say that Michal Shapira did a service to me because she just took off the first page of the lecture by giving you a good sense of the scope of the book. So that's great, saves me a couple of minutes. So let me get the PowerPoint up and just someone confirm for me verbally that you can see it. Yeah?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. Okay, let's see. Sorry, let's see, sharing the screen. Are you sure that I'm a host? That's, here we go, here we go. Here we go. Yeah. Here we go. Sorry about that.
Here, now it's coming up.
It's coming up now?
Yes.
But I can't see it. Okay, 2 seconds. Let's get this together.
That's okay. We're all here.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Never a dull moment. This doesn't count for my lecture time. I'm saying that right now.
Don't considering everything that could happen today, it's, you know, minor.
Can I blame it on the Russians?
Exactly.
Sorry. I have to have a sense of humor because otherwise I'll throw myself out the window.
No. Here it's starting to shift. Good.
Okay.
Now we see it. Great.
Okay. I apologize for that. Okay.
No, don't
so
worry.
Okay, so you see it now very clear?
Yep.
Okay, great. So Writing a Life in History, Lucy S. Dawidowicz, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History. So I want to start by saying that my training, and this is an interesting conversation we can have later in the Q&A, is very much a North American training in the field of Jewish history. And we can specify a little bit about that. But I was trained very, very broadly from antiquity until the present, and only focused later, you know, when you do the dissertation, on your field of expertise, which for me was the Jews of Eastern Europe, particularly on Poland. But my training, again, is very, very broad. And I see myself that way. And I see myself as an historian, an intellectual, cultural historian of modern Jews, particularly Jews of Eastern Europe. And that is why I could write a book, my first book, on the 18th century, on the Haskalah and the Jewish Enlightenment in Poland, and then write a book on a 20th century figure. And for me, there's a connective tissue between those two projects. And that's not muvan me'elav, that's not self-evident to certain kinds of training that certain historiographic traditions have, I would say probably in Israel or in Europe. It's not the same. So I think that that's something we could engage later, as all of you are, of course, in training as historians. But for me, this book asked in many ways the same kinds of questions that I asked of my first book, which was again focused on the late 18th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then the transition to the Austrian partition of Poland after the partitions. And those are the questions of modern Jewish culture, politics, and identity. And again, those are the questions that continue to engage me. Lucy S. Dawidowicz became a perfect vehicle for those questions because she is and was a transnational figure avant la lettre before it became the it phrase of our field. She was literally a transnational figure. And the book is written to reflect her transnationality and her life. And so I hope this next slide has come up. So just someone nod for me, just to confirm. Okay, good. So we're all working. So the book is written in 4 sections. Part 1 is in New York City in the interwar years. Part 2 in Poland, refugee New York City and Germany. Part 3, becoming an American. And part 4, Eastern Europe in America. And the 4 sections are chronological, but they're also transnational. They deal with her, if you will, her immigrant identity, her European identity, and I'll say more about that, then her re-encounter, if you will, with the America in which she was born after her life experiences in Europe. And then the last part, Eastern Europe and America, is my way of grappling with her political shift to the right, where she has absorbed, to my mind, an East European, a historiographic conclusions based on Eastern Europe. So that's what the book does. And she's transnationally, literally, because she actually goes back and forth. And Professor Shapira indicated this, and I will talk more about it. She's an immigrant daughter born in New York City, but makes two fateful trips to Europe. One, which we now know was before the catastrophe or the Holben or the Shoah or the Holocaust. Pick your lexical definition, we can argue about it. And then she returns to Europe after the war, after the destruction, and works in the American and British zones of occupied Germany. And then again, returns back to her mother country, to New York, and to her mother city, New York City. So she goes back and forth. So her transnationality is embodied, if you will, not only in her ideas, but in her person. And this has an enormous effect on who she is. I want to say one other thing. The book is quote unquote a biography, but biography is not in the title because I didn't want to be pigeonholed that somehow, it's a study of interiority or a literary study, which it's not. It is, I use her life and her person, as I said, to get at some, what I think are very big questions of modern Jewish history, life, politics, identity, language, and politics particularly, but you would be disappointed, or if you're interested in kind of her interior thoughts and reflections on herself and her private life, which some people expect of biographies today, you won't really get that in this book. And that's for several reasons. I think one is her temperament and mine, if you will. Not so interested in kiss and tell biographies. I don't find them that interesting as an historian, but also she likely got rid of the most intimate papers in her life. And we can talk more about that. The book starts off with a letter from her good friend, the writer Cynthia Ozick, a fascinating novelist and short story and essayist of the post-war period, who's younger than Dawidowicz, but a peer in many ways. And Ozick writes to her in 1987 and says, "Don't destroy your papers. How could you do this? If it weren't for Max Brod, we wouldn't have Kafka, and you're still mad at this one for doing it. How dare you do this? What about your biographers?" So, in fact, I looked through every kvittel, every piece of paper that I think Lucy wrote, and there aren't that many very private papers, particularly those in relationship to the man who became her husband. And I think she deliberately got rid of those. She lived in a period when the private and the public were separate spheres, or she embraced that binary. And she really didn't want people to expose her private life. So I can sense her personality from her wit, from her dry prose, from her extraordinary, concise, lapidary prose, but there isn't a lot of interiority in the book, or at least I don't think I presented her that way. So in that regard, it is a biography, but it's a biography of a period through a person. And the period is her life, which is 1915 to 1990. And it bears saying that this is, of course, a period of extraordinary change for the modern Jews, and also for Americans, and of course, the Cold War, the significance of the Cold War. Her life is really bookended by the Soviets period, and she is a fierce anti-communist, and this, of course, has great bearing on her life. The questions I wanted to ask in the book, I think will come up. I won't enumerate them now, but in essence, how do modern Jews negotiate their Jewish selves, their group identity with the host countries in which they live? And of course, I think this applies to the modern state of Israel. The question of how Jews and Israeli Jews do and do not negotiate their relationship to the Jewish past. So again, lots of food for thought later on. The other very important, I guess, intervention, which is the way we talk these days, I'm being tongue in cheek, I don't love all this new language, I have to say, but I wanted my book to engage directly with the lives of and the historiography on a very distinct group of male immigrant Jews, the New York intellectuals, the so-called New York intellectuals. And here they are in all their well-suited glory. And I think the images are very important, actually, because they give you a sense of the moment, right? These pictures of these men, often with a cigarette in hand, always wearing suits, very proper. These were the immigrant sons who came of age in the mid 20th century, were men of letters, writers, critics, scholars, some, and who were known initially for their cosmopolitanism, for their marginality, for their alienation from American society. They traded on that identity as immigrant outsiders, and yet they enter the American mainstream in many ways and become pundits, polemicists, and public intellectuals. And their dates, their chronology is exactly that of Lucy Schildkret, her maiden name, Lucy S. Dawidowicz. Some were born, in 1910, some were born in 1926. It doesn't really matter, it's a cohort. And they talked to each other, they read each other, they argued with each other. And some of them, not all of them, moved politically from the left, usually the anti-Stalinist Trotskyite left, to the right. Not all of them, but Irving Kristol did. Nathan Glazer and Daniel Bell kind of waver in the middle. Podhoretz does. Kazin did not, and Howe did not. And Lucy Schildkret, then Lucy Dawidowicz, is very much a New York Jewish intellectual like them, but she's different from them. And that is part of what I wanted to narrate in the book, was why was she different? And she was different for a whole host of reasons: her sex, her lack of public persona until much later. But most importantly, she was different for, in my conclusion, and again, Michal intimated this, because of her deep rootedness in Jewish culture. They were marginal. She was not, in terms of Jewish culture, identity, politics, and language. And that's what I emphasize, that Yiddish culture, diaspora nationalism, and a global sense of belonging to this inchoate thing we can sometimes call the Jewish people was the leitmotif, or the rooted source of her identity. And that was very different from them. She was educated in both New York institutions, and here we see her Hunter College graduation picture on the right, but she was also educated in Yiddishist institutions, which I'll get to in a second. But here you see her immigrant bona fides. She was a Hunter College, it was a single-sex school in the CUNY public system in New York. Like the men who all went to CCNY, which was single-sex men's college, she went to the girls' parallel school. And those women were every bit as smart as the guys. I can tell you they all studied the classics. 80 to 90% of the student body at Hunter College for women and at Brooklyn College were immigrant daughters. But because gendered female, they had very different professional trajectories than the men. Lucy, again, is singular in that she has a professional life, but she was educated in the American school system. And you see on the left that she was literary editor of the student newspaper, or magazine rather. And this, it's red 1935 color, tells you where her political affiliations were in those years. She was a member of the Young Communist League for about 2 years. And then she resigns in 1936 at the time of the Moscow trials. But this was her, her youthful radicalism and association with the Communist Party. At the same time that she was educated in the American school system as an immigrant kid, she was also educated, and this is different from the men, in the Yiddishist school system of the immigrants. There were 4 Yiddishist supplementary school systems in New York City in the interwar years. 2 of them were associated with political parties. The Arbeiter Ring, or the Workmen's Circle, was associated with the Socialist Party and all of its institutions, which I can talk more about. After the split with the Socialist Party, when the Communist Party and the Soviet Union forms, the communists created their own supplementary school system, and that's called the International Arbeiter Olden. And there were schools, magazines, summer camps. Lucy went to the nonpartisan, unaffiliated Yiddishist schools and Mittel School, which was the high school program, and the summer camp. And that's what you see on the left, which is the brochure from Camp Boibelik. And on the right, you see one of my favorite of many, many favorite documents, a letter she wrote to her friend when she was still in the Young Communist League in Yiddish, telling her friend Evelyn that she got the Yiddish typewriter from the Communist Party. And you see in red, it says, "Long live the Soviet Union." So what I wanted you to understand here is that she has a hyphenated identity from the get-go as a Yiddishist daughter, as an immigrant daughter, as becoming an American. And she differs from the men because she has a Jewish education. She's reading in Yiddish, writing in Yiddish, interacting with immigrants from Europe. And that is what sends her to Europe, because her teacher, Yakov Szatzki, an extremely important Polish Jewish historian who I'm happy to say is about to get his due in English in a new book by my colleague and friend Natalia Lekshin called Conscious History, about the whole school of Polish Jewish historians that very few people except the old guard in Israel know about. There's a real gap in the understanding of writing Jewish history, and the Polish Jewish historians from Galicia and then from the interwarriors fall out. Yakov Szatzki is incredibly important, and he's an immigrant, and he is involved with the YIVO, the Jewish Scientific Institute, the Yiddische Wissenschaftliche Institute, and he encourages the young Lucy after her college years to go to Vilna to study with Max Weinreich and the historians at the YIVO, which is a secular university undergirded by diaspora nationalist commitments, flying the flag of Shimon Dubnov's commitments to Jewish peoplehood and to Jewish historical research and to collection and to Yiddish philology and to history. So she goes. In 1938, she sails to Poland, right? In August 1938, which today seems shocking to us, but we always need to remember as historians that we don't know what comes tomorrow. We never know what comes tomorrow. We're living that every moment today, right? So just look at your emails from early March when there was no coronavirus, and then see what happens by mid-March. So she goes to Poland. She's in the 4th cohort of the research fellowship, which is known as the Aspirantur. And you see her on the upper right in the library of the YIVO, a happy graduate student, right? Which again, that's sort of an oxymoron for many of us, but she was a happy graduate student. At the bottom are her cohort of other aspiranten, other research fellows, all of whom were European. She's the only American. Again, this is a signal moment in the creation of herself, being an American in an East European context. Weinreich is in that picture. Her beloved mentor, Zelig Kalmanovich, is in Palestine, where his son is gone, and he's visiting him. But Zelig and his wife, Rivala Kalmanovich, are critical human parental surrogates for Lucy. And he's not in the picture, and he will later perish in Estonia during the war, as will Rivala. Very, again, important human part of her story. And the upper left, which is very hard for you to see, I imagine, on your screens, but it is the list of research topics. And Lucy's is the 4th from the bottom. You have to trust me, A, if you can't see it, and B, if you don't read Yiddish handwriting or Yiddish at all. But it says the Yiddish press in England. And that was her thesis topic. So already she's honing her skills as an historian. She's doing research on the Yiddish press. She's working with Weinreich to translate. In 1939, when the Hitler-Stalin Pact is signed, she receives a letter from the American government urging all American nationals to flee. Her friends in Europe say to her in no uncertain terms, "You're an American, you've never lived through a war, go." Of course, they don't know what the war will bring either, right? I mean, They hear the drums of Nazism on their western flank, but they do not know what will happen. She takes a harrowing train trip, which I find so amazing all the time. She takes it from Vilna to Warsaw to Berlin and then to Copenhagen. She arrives in Copenhagen in early September 1939 and has to wait for a boat, right? All the boats have been requisitioned for the war. All the ports are closed. And she waits, and at that point they hear the news not only of the invasion by the Germans of Western Poland, but by September 17th, the occupation by the Soviets of Eastern Poland. Again, fateful, because Vilna is under Soviet occupation, not under German occupation, which means the Jews in Vilna are quote unquote safe, at least from the Nazis for 18 months. But if you're a socialist, if you're a Yiddishist, you're not necessarily safe. The fate of the YIVO is Bolshevized. Max Weinreich is also not in Poland at that point. He's in Copenhagen serendipitously. So she actually spends that waiting period in Copenhagen doing some touring with Max Weinreich's youngest son, Uriel Weinreich, who becomes a very, very famous linguist in the field of Yiddish studies. We have to fast forward here because of time, which I'm running out of, I know already. She goes back to New York, and the war years are very significant because she works at the YIVO as Max Weinreich's secretary, and she works with the refugee scholars there. So again, this is her European experience, even in America. She's functioning in Yiddish, she's meeting refugees. As Yiddishist, transnational or internationalists, they know more than most Americans about what's going on in Europe because they're getting Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish bulletins. And that's, again, a whole historiographic debate about what Americans did or did not know and what American Jews did or did not do. And I have a strong feeling about the misreading of that. But the point is simply that the Jews of the YIVO knew what was going on. And Lucy actually drew a map in the YIVO Blätter of 1940 of the Warsaw Ghetto, outlining the Warsaw Ghetto. And the man that she fell in love with, Szymon Dawidowicz, from whom she gets her Polish name, his family, his first family, his wife and 2 children are living in Warsaw. So they're well aware of what's going on. And of course, Max Weinreich is well aware and a nervous wreck about what's going on with the YIVO library and the other libraries of Vilna because of the Nazis' campaign against Jewish culture and the whole Rosenberg operation, which has hired experts in Judaica to plunder the Jewish libraries of Europe, including the great libraries of Vilna. So she's on the ground working with Weinreich when all of this is happening. After the war, she decides to return to Europe, and she ends up working in both the American and British zones of occupied Germany. 2 very different stories, which I can tell you more about in the Q&A. But in the American zone is where the libraries and written material have been collected in a very huge depot called the Offenbach Archival Depot. And through a series of missives that come from American soldiers, some of whom are YIVO activists, Max Weinreich is aware that Vilna's libraries, what's left, are now in Offenbach. And Lucy is able to convince her higher ups in the Joint Distribution Committee to go to the Offenbach Archival Depot, where she already is familiar, to catalog the books. She had already been doing some of that work for the Joint Distribution Committee to get textbooks for the DP camp schools, for the children's schools. So she works for 3 months in the Offenbach Archival Depot in Frankfurt, cataloging the books. And again, there's a lot of really superb new scholarship on this collection depot and on the various, how shall I say, the various claims on Jewish cultural property after the war. Cecil Roth from England, Gershom Scholem and Hugo Bergman from the Hebrew University, Sela Baron and Hannah Arendt, Lucy Schildkrit. Everyone is trying to figure out, A, what books and manuscripts are there? B, how valuable are they? C, to whom should they be returned? And D, can I get my hands on something without anyone seeing and get it out of Europe before someone else makes a claim on it? And this is a very compelling and complicated story, because we need to remember that in 1946 and 47, I don't think there's a person in the world who really thought there was going to be a future for the Jews in Europe. So at that moment, they're involved with what we would call salvage and rescue. Later on in the narrative, perhaps we're looking at theft. And Lisa Leff has talked about this in her wonderful book on Zosha Tchaikovsky. So these are very, again, complicated issues. Lucy is on the ground with this issue, and she helps catalog the books that are sent to New York, 420 cases. And you see on the right, you see the men of the YIVO opening up the boxes, opening up the cartons. And she details this in her memoir. It's a very, very moving story. The middle slide shows you the journal by survivor historians, a part of the historical commissions in the DP camps, von Letzten, Holben. Again, this is a critically important activity for her. She helps get the Yiddish linotype so the survivor historians can publish. Already they're doing what we would call Holbenforschung, that is scholarship on the catastrophe, right? So again, there's a lot of conversation about when the Holocaust is known and who writes about it and how we trust testimonies and what do the survivors have to contribute. There's a huge amount of writing on this topic. And I'm not really a historian of the Holocaust, but I, of course, have learned a lot of it. What's important here is that the survivor historians in the DP camps are already doing scholarship. They're already doing translations. They're already interviewing each other. And she's involved with this. She's involved with this activity. And she has some critical views of the survivors. But nonetheless, these historical commissions are very, very important. And historiographically, for our purposes and for my book, it's very important because their historiography does several things. It documents the past. It does so not only to document the past objectively as historians, but to provide evidence, if you will, for future criminal trials. So there's another purpose of it. It also commemorates the past, right? So it's involved with memory creation or memory culture. And all of those themes are part and parcel of this East European historiographic tradition, initiated again by Dubnow and by generations of Polish Jewish historians after Dubnow from the late 19th century forward, which is what is the purpose of writing Jewish history and what is the purpose of writing Jewish history in Jewish languages. And I argue that Lucy S. Dawidowicz is the American link in that historiographic tradition, and that she was already getting trained in that tradition from her years at the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute, her association with the YIVO, her work with the historical commissions in the DP camps, her work with cataloging YIVO's books. All of these things are part of a training to be part of that kind of historiograph tradition. That is, how does one write Jewish history? The last slide I'll show you is in this one, the last image is of a group of nurses and doctors affiliated with the Poppendorf DP camp. These were the refugees from the Exodus who were sent back to Germany and interned in camps in the British zone of occupation. The last 6 months of Lucy's work with the JDC was actually in the British zone of occupation, where, of course, we now know a great Zionist drama is unfolding. She herself was a non-Zionist. She comes from a left socialist tinged diaspora nationalist, very fierce diaspora nationalist ideological place. Zionism means little to her in those years, which itself is very interesting in terms of what she will do later in life. So this, again, is all of how she acquired a European soul. When she gets back to the United States, she's got to look for work. And again, this is different from many other women, other well-educated immigrant daughters who married and may not have gone to work outside the home, what we say outside the home. She had to work. She got married to Shimon Dawidowicz. His first family had been murdered in the Warsaw Ghetto, probably in Treblinka, and then in the ghetto fighting itself. His daughter was a ghetto Kämpfer. She died at the end of the uprising. And Lucy goes to work for the American Jewish Committee, one of the foremost agencies of Jewish advocacy, defense, and also of civil rights and pluralism. And you may know that the American Jewish Committee was founded by Central European Jews who did not believe that the Jews were a political entity or a nation. Rather, the Jews were a religion, sort of the confessionalization of Jewish civilization into religion and civil participation. That's the environment that this East European diaspora nationalist is working in. You can imagine there was probably a culture shock, but I use these 20 years of her life and I call it, she becomes an American. She learns about mainstream Jewish organization. She learns about how certain Jews define the Jews as a religion. And she's doing this, again, at the height of the Cold War, when Jewishness, or Judaism more accurately, is welcomed into the triangle of three monotheistic faiths that are seen as patriotic American faiths: Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism, right? America is embracing faith against Cold War atheism, right? You know, Frederick Douglass, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's famous For Freedom speech is that Americans go to fight World War II for the freedom of religion. So the American Jewish Committee emphasizes the religion of the Jews, which is separate from their civic political identity and politics. And she learns all this while she's there at the committee. And so this informs her worldview about what it is what is a Jew. You know, religion, quote unquote, had not been very important to her. She also works, as you see in the slide, on liberal anti-communism, particularly vis-a-vis the Jewish left. And she works on what was then called Negro-Jewish relations. Today we would call Black-Jewish relations, at the height of, I would say, the moderate civil rights movement. And the American Jewish Committee is extremely important, as is the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Congress, in fighting for civil rights for what we now say people of color. But the fight is a fight through the legal system. The fight is nonviolent. Again, Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King Jr., these are the figures of the civil rights movement who work directly with the committee. It's very, very important that people understand today how active Jewish liberal organizations were in civil rights before, quote unquote, the turn to a more militant civil rights movement in the mid to late 60s. And again, she's involved with all of these issues. And she's also beginning to think about writing on Eastern Europe, and publishes her first book, The Golden Tradition, first main book, The Golden Tradition, which is important because it is an anthology of primary sources from Jewish voices from Eastern Europe. Again, this is a historiographic step. She's arguing in the production of this book that the way to know Jewish history is from the Jews themselves, what today we would call from the bottom up. Then, again, she was looking at literate, individuals who wrote. So again, it's the cultural, not elitism, but a cultural expertise. But it is from the bottom up. It's from the people themselves, not from depictions of them. And this is a historiographic claim that, again, she gets from her diaspora nationalism, from the Hohlbund-Forschung of the survivor historians, from the YIVO, and it will inform the way she approaches the study of the Holocaust. That's why this book is so important to understand. It asserts her diaspora nationalism ideologically, the civilization of Eastern Ashkenaz that she loved and that she encountered, and that she thinks needs a voice in English. So of course she translates this for the American public. She leaves the committee and goes to start teaching at Stern College of Yeshiva University. And what's important is that she was not hired to teach on what we now call the Holocaust, but that Holocaust consciousness is now growing in the United States. And she is tasked to teach a course on the Holocaust. And she realizes that there are very few books from the perspective of the Jews in English. Again, in Israel, it's a whole different ballgame, not only because of Yad Vashem, but because of a cadre of East European historians like Natan Michael Gelber, and the literary historians Chona Shmeruk and Dov Sedan, and a whole host of other, Philip Friedman's work, which is being written in Hebrew and Yiddish. So in Israel, and again, I can't really speak to it, but historiographic available work for a public that can read those language. In the United States, it's a different set of issues, because the majority of American Jews are not reading in Hebrew and Yiddish, right? The survivors are, but not even their descendants. So she sets out to create a course, a seminar on the Holocaust at Stern College. It's one of the first courses in the Holocaust. And in this is the first page of the syllabus, remember those syllabi. And what's important is the first section, which is probably hard for you to read, and it says antecedents and substructure from Mein Kampf to the Wannsee Conference. And we could spend a whole session talking about that, from Mein Kampf, 1925, to the Wannsee Conference of 1942. What is she saying? She's saying that she believes that the final solution was intentional. She's known as an intentionalist historian, that already the plans, the blueprint, were articulated in Mein Kampf by Hitler. She's making another historiographic claim, that ideas matter, anti-Semitism matters, and men of history matter, right? Again, this is a little bit, you know, we've come so far and come back again about how we think history moves or what really shapes history. She was very clear. Ideas, men in history, men in power. And when it came to the Jews of Europe, the anti-Semitic traditions of the past mattered. And the final solution didn't just emerge in 1942 because of the success of Operation Barbarossa. It didn't just emerge because of bureaucratic decisions. She believes and articulates in the book that made her famous, The War Against the Jews, 1933 to 1945, that there was a linear, intentional directive, even if there's no smoking gun in the documents, from Nazi ideology, which is generated by Hitler. So this is, again, the claim she makes in 1975. And the book is very well received, very well received. And our New York intellectuals, who I haven't talked about in a little bit, our men, some of them have begun to reassess their own relationship to cosmopolitanism, universalism, and Jewish culture. Notably, Irving Howe and Lazer Greenberg have an entire project of translating Yiddish literature into English. Many others are beginning to write and think about the effect of the war, and they admit in their own writings that they had not been thinking about the Jewish question, if you will, or the destruction of European Jewry while the war was unfolding. But by the 70s, they are. And guess what? Lucy is there for them to read. So you have this moment where she arrives with a background, with a European knowledge, with a Jewish historical knowledge, with Yiddish, with the encounter with the luminaries of the YIVO before the war, at a moment when the New York intellectuals who have the public power of culture to anoint her as the voice of Eastern Europe. And that's exactly what happens. Irving Howe writes a major review in the New York Times Book Review. And the book is reviewed in every scholarly journal, you know, Slavic Studies and East European Studies, and some critical and some not. But nonetheless, she's on the stage. She has become a Jewish public intellectual. Well, let me just go back. Sorry about that. I know I probably Michal, just give me like your hand up when I have to just sum up. I have my watch.
You're good. We have a few minutes.
Okay, so I wanted to say something about the war against the Jews historiographically. I mentioned already the intentionalism and the linearity and the centrality of language and rhetoric and of Hitler's persona. That's the first part of the book, right? Which is called the final solution. The second part of the book is called the Holocaust. And it starts with the Jewish community and how the Jewish community, the Kehillah, functioned first in German lands when the Nazis come to power, and then in Eastern Europe. And you see her commitment to the Jewish experience in history, Jewish agency. And this was one of the first books to talk about the fact that there was life in the ghettos, obviously a miserable life, but there were underground Jewish schools, there were garden projects, there were soup kitchens. You know, Lucy Dawidowicz paid attention to the soup ladlers in the communal kitchens. She didn't only pay attention to the ghetto fighters. So there are a lot of things going on for her historiographically in how she wrote the second part of the book. She knows well about the ghetto fighters. Her husband's daughter's picture is hanging in their house her entire life as a kind of iconic altar to what had happened to Topcha. But Dawidowicz resented and criticized the obsession with Amidah. She didn't know the Hebrew word. I'm using it for her audience today, for resistance, which she saw as a distortion of the experience of the Chorban, of the Holocaust. For her, the survivors and the fighters were not the story. The story was the successful destruction of Jewish culture in Europe, in the heartland, in Poland. The war against the Jews in that regard was successful. And the triumphalist narrative of givurah, of heroism, was a distortion. And there's a lot in my book about her reaction to the iconization of Marek Edelman, the great commander, the last commander of the Warsaw Ghetto, who himself didn't want to become an icon, but he's become one. You know, the forces of mythology, of myth-making, are so great. The War Against the Jews, second part, is also, in my view, a rebuttal to Hannah Arendt, to Eichmann in Jerusalem, obviously an extremely important reportage, albeit a somewhat flimsy reportage of the Eichmann trial, but where Arendt, among other infamous claims, blamed the men of the Jewish councils and the Jewish police for rounding up the Jews in the ghettos. And she says, if they hadn't done what they had done, you know, many fewer people would have been murdered. That is, she sees a complicity or collaboration on the part of the men of the Jewish councils, as well as her own emphasis on the bureaucratization of the final solution. And those two claims in the book really set Dawidowicz off. She's not the only one who set off, you know, many, many Jewish intellectuals transnationally, Gershom Scholem famously, Lenny Yehiel and others, New York intellectuals, react to Hannah Arendt's book. There are many books written about it. Richard Cohen wrote his master's on it. Could go on and on. But The War Against the Jews is a reaction to Arendt. And you will find her name only in one footnote, where Lucy Dawidowicz basically says, you know, Arendt doesn't know what she's talking about. You know, the most of the men of the Judenrat did their best, of the Judenräte did their best to buy time. And no one knew what was going to happen. And some of you may know that some men of the Judenräte, Adam Cherniakov in Warsaw, committed suicide when he was asked to give up 6,000 Jews a day in the Great Liquidation. He refused to do it and he killed himself. He committed suicide. And many of the ghetto fighters were angry at him for doing that because they felt that he was not setting a good model for how to survive. So these debates about the men of the Judenräte are very complex. And Lucy really learned from Yeshayahu Trunk, from his book on the Judenräte, and she refused to condemn the men of the Judenräte. And this is important not only for this book, The War Against the Jews, but will become part of her political skepticism about a certain new left historiographic tradition, which comes of age after, like in the late 70s, early 80s, which makes resistance and agitation and militancy the goal of politics. And if you recall, I said that she had become more Americanized or more mainstream through her work with the American Jewish Committee. And she brings that political sensibility to her reaction to the new left. So she's very hostile to the new left. And the other aspect of being hostile to the new left has to do with the way the new left begins to view the modern state of Israel as just another rapacious imperial modern state vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And again, it's a much longer story that we can maybe get to in the Q&A, but when the new left criticizes Israel and Zionism as again, this predacious ideology without recognizing the roots of Zionism in the collective future of the Jewish people from the late 19th century, and of course, through the 20th, and then as a response to the Holocaust, Lucy and other New York Jewish intellectuals move away from that politics. They don't believe in the agitation and the resistance and the militancy, which is coupled with civil rights militancy. They don't like the counterculture's culture, which they see as throwing dirt or shade into the integrationist institutions like the university, the meritocracy, that the immigrant children had used to become upwardly mobile. And she recoils from the critique, from the criticism of Israel and of Zionism. This puts her into the right-wing camp. And in 1984, she infamously or famously makes a speech to the American Jewish public at the 92nd Street Y, and she basically says, you should vote for the Republican Party, right? Abandon the Democrats. The left wing of the Democratic Party is anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. I can say more about it. I just want to give you two more images.
Yeah, and then Nancy, let's wrap things up. Yep.
Yeah, at the end of her life, remember the despair I mentioned at the beginning. She was no longer, her worldview was no longer embraced by young historians. Her Jewish particularism was seen as problematic for American multiculturalism. And she was alone personally. So she turned back to Yiddish culture, which again, as I said, was the wellspring or the leitmotif of her life. And she wrote her book From That Place and Time, which is a reflection on Yiddish culture. And she raised money for the translation of Yiddish and Jewish literature. And I just want to show you that a book that just came out recently, the full English translation of the memoirs of Glickol, that great autobiographist woman, magisтерiously done by Chava Torniansky, my colleague in Yiddish in Israel, was supported by the Fund for Translation of Jewish Literature, and those monies were raised by Lucy S. Dawidowicz, and you see here the frontispiece that honors that. So she moved from left to right, but reading and right to left, and the Yiddish language as the bedrock of diaspora nationalism was the foundation of her life and her work, and I think explains who she was politically. Thank you very much. Toda rabba lechem.
Thank you, Nancy. What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And your book is such a masterful work of historical writing. I really enjoy reading it. It's such a remarkable achievement of so many years of research. And I remember you talking about Lucy Dawidowicz for so many years. So congratulations on this really impressive triumph. I recommend for everyone to buy the book and read the book. It's just wonderful and very kind of quick to read, very easy to read, so immensely readable and fascinating.
Bli jargon.
Yeah, that's true. It's really beautifully written and made me feel like, sorry for saying it in such a silly way, that she was almost like the Forrest Gump of Jewish history. She was always in the right moment in the right time, right? So let me just ask you one question. I prepared 20 questions, but there's so many people here, so let everyone else ask their question. I just wanted to start the discussion with maybe one question, since you talked more about the period of the post-war period where she was working with the Jewish refugees at the DP camps. Maybe you could say just a little bit more about her time in Vilna in 1938. How did she view the situation of the Jews there? It's true that no one knew what would happen. No one knew that there would be a Holocaust. Still, it is 1938, a tense time. And, you know, people did know that something quite dramatic might happen, right? Like already in 1938, and by the time she's leaving, and especially after the Hitler-Stalin pact was signed. So obviously a dramatic time. So if you could say a little bit more about how did she view the world there? I mean, amazing, right? Like not all of us went on a research trip to Vilna in 1938.
Right.
Good time.
But I do think about graduate students today, if they were lucky enough to get a travel grant last year and then they end up in COVID, you know, like they're going to reflect on this later. And so one of the challenges, first of all, thank you for the question. One of the challenges is that, you know, she wrote a memoir, a beautiful memoir. And that was actually why I wrote the book about her, because I read the memoir in 1989 when it first came out. And because I was involved with Yiddish culture. I mean, let's just put that out there. I mean, in my own entryway was through Yiddish language and the Yivo and Yiddish culture. So I read the book. I was not interested in writing about the Holocaust. So the book is fantastic, the memoir, but it's a memoir, and we all know it's selective, and we all know it's retrospective. So I think one of the challenges is separating what she felt at the moment in 1938, in that fateful year, and what she then reflected on. I will tell you that she kept all of her documents, and she really walked the walk of looking back at the newspapers of the period and tried to challenge her own memory. But look, certainly the streets of Vilna could be a very dangerous place for Jews in this period. And she talks about that. She talks about hooliganism. And hooliganism was street violence. And she witnessed it. And the problem with the hooliganism is much of it came from students from the university. The universities had been tainted with anti-Jewish rhetoric. And, she narrates what it was like to walk through the streets of Vilna and have to kind of hide, like Chaim Grada, the great Yiddish writer, at one point, like pulled her to like a cul-de-sac so they wouldn't be victimized. Max Weinreich himself, her mentor, father figure, all these things, he was blind in one eye from a student attack. So Mayor Balaban also was attacked. So I think it's important for a couple of reasons. I know I'm going off a little bit, but it already sets in motion as well then Max Weinreich's very important book, Hitler's Professors, which was written in Yiddish and she helped get translated into English. It helps us to understand her skepticism about the university as a place of tolerance, because she lived in a period when the university could be a place of racism, of anti-Semitism, and with the imprimatur of being a university. So that all those things are going on, but she's spending her time in a little bit of a silo, a happy silo, right? She's going to and from the YIVO, going to the Strasslund Library. She's surrounded by Yiddishists. She's surrounded by Weinreich, who's like this indefatigable, optimistic person. She feels fortunate in that she's an American. So she's well aware, everyone's aware, but look, you know this and I know this, as historians, it's not the interwar years until September 1st. And World War I as a conventional war is completely different from World War II vis-a-vis the fate of the Jews. I mean, today, historians, fortunately, are doing a lot of work on the pogrom violence or the violence by armies perpetrated against the Jews of Eastern Europe during World War I, because the soldiers are going back and forth in the heartland of Jewish settlement, and they victimize the Jews. Sometimes they victimize them just because they're civilians. Sometimes they victimize them because they're Jews. Sometimes they victimize them because they think they're spies. But it's, if you will, it's rather conventional anti-Jewish violence, right? The final solution is a completely different order of violence, mechanized, chemicalized, state, so I think that did someone like Kalmanovich or the Raisins fear what a war would bring? Of course they did, but they thought it would be the war that they knew. Sounds so terrible. Starvation, disease, family separation.
All these, yeah.
But no one, I mean, I really, it's interesting, no one could imagine gas vans. No one could imagine gas vans. You would have had to know about the experiments that Hitler was doing on the mentally ill. So I would say that the book reflects a sense of dread, but not any kind of prognostication. I hope I answered your question. I will say something about the silo. A friend of mine, a colleague, historian, well-known historian in Israel, who works on Vilna and social history of Vilna, says, her memoir is so distorted because she talks about the Yiddishists and she talks about the YIVO and she talks about the poor, but she doesn't pay any attention to the religious people in Vilna. She doesn't pay attention to the acculturated Jews of Vilna. That's true. That's true. Because the book is a memoir. It's a rumination on secular Jewish culture and on secular Yiddish culture. She's working through this ideology in her life. What did it mean? What were its successes? What kind of glue can it offer the next generation? The book is not merely a memoir, if there is such a thing, merely a memoir. So her book From That Place and Time is fantastic, but it won't tell you about, it won't tell you a lot about the yeshiva boys. I mean, she mentions them, but it's not her world, right, for obvious reasons. Yeah. It will tell you about cigarettes and booze a little bit.
Right. All the fun in Vilna.
All the fun things that graduate students do. or used to do.
Yeah. Great, Miri?
Yes, thank you very much, Nancy. And I urge everyone to think about questions, and you can use the chat box to write your questions. Nancy, I want to ask you about, could you please reflect about your methodology? You wrote a biography, and in recent years, we see re-emergence of this genre. And we can think about the 2009 roundtable published by the American Historical Review. And for the students, if you are not familiar with this piece, please look at it. It's a very important piece of methodology and historiography to get acquainted with. And so how do you see yourself within that kind of discussion of historians writing biographies at the beginning of the 21st century? This is one aspect of the methodology. Another aspect of methodology, several times in your talk, you used a very specific phrase, history shapes reality, and men of history and women of history shape reality. And today is, of course, November 3rd, and there is something going on in the US today. So in what way do you think about your work and or the people that you are writing about as relevant to what is going on in the US these days? By the way, when I heard you talking about Lucy Dawidowicz, I could think about my aunts in Florida and Long Island. In many ways, these are very similar ladies. So what's your take on these issues?
Okay, so I'll start with the first, and then I may ask you to clarify a little bit more how you want me to address the second, or if I can. I'll be honest, and I'm old enough now that I always say, maybe I always did, I kind of say, I'm very candid. I sometimes read books of history, and I try and read widely, and I think to myself, well, that's an interesting topic, and they solved a little problem. I know that sounds kind of snide, and I don't mean to be snide, but okay, they found a problem. No one else thought about that problem, and okay, you learn from it, and it's good. And I think this is a little bit what I sort of suggested at the beginning. I think it really reflects my training, where I trained. I trained at Columbia University at a very specific time. My mentors, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, Alav Shalom, I dedicate the book to him. My mentor, Michael Stanislavski, I just did a Zoom thing with him. I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for my training. I think it's the right way to do things. And it's fair to say that this method of sort of getting at a worldview or zeitgeist through a person is part of, I mean, not Michael's first book, but his biography of Yalag, of Yehuda Lev Golden, and Yerushalmi's masterful From Spanish Court to Italian Ghetto on the twin biographies of the Cardozo brothers. So in some ways, that's kind of how I was trained, but it clearly speaks to me. I mean, it makes sense for me methodologically. And I have to tell you the truth. I don't really know if I chose it or it chose me. I know, at different points I thought, oh, I should push myself to do different kind of historical thinking and writing. I should start looking at tax codes, or I should, you have to do what you're good at. I mean, I always tell my graduate students this, when I do work with the sources you want to work with, that you feel that you're capable. There's too much out there. In the modern period, there's a massive amount of material. You're going to have to like what you do. Otherwise it's too hard. And so, I mean, I hope I'm answering the question. I mean, this is the way I like working with, meaning written sources, right? I do look at images, and I'll tell you one, not mistake, but one thing I wish I had done after, in a second, I'll tell you. So I like working with that material. I think I have a skill working with that material. I knew I wanted to work with Jewish language sources, right? I didn't want to just write on US. So all my work has engaged either Hebrew or Yiddish. I want to be in conversation with my colleagues in Germany and in Israel. I mean, I can't tell you how gratifying this is for me. I think it means something. So that's methodologically.
Nancy, you were born to write this biography.
So I mean, did I choose it? But then my methodology is, for better or for worse, I am thorough. And it's a curse. And I don't know if it's gendered. I have to tell you that. I mean, I really read everything. I read everything. And
Yeah.
and the thing about Lucy S. Dawidowicz, you know, when I told people I was writing this book, universally they dismissed it. I mean, it was so misogynist. And it was like, She was tough. She wasn't that nice. Even female historians, oh, she wasn't nice to me. It was like, is that a way we evaluate anything? But yeah, we do. People want people to be nice. I want people to be nice to me when I sit and have coffee with them, but I don't expect the historians of the past to be nice to me. Anyway, but so I was very, very thorough. And I want to just say, I had the great fortune of having her, quote, professional archive. I also found her niece, who gave me papers and images, like a lot of my, the material culture I have, the passports and her ticket, the menu on the boats, you know, all that kind of stuff. But whenever I saw a name in the, whenever I saw a correspondent's name, I then searched their archive. And often I would get the second part of the conversation. So I had a great moment in one of my favorite places, which is the Machon L'Kitvei Yad in Givat Ram, couple of years ago, and I had the correspondence with Gershom Sholem because she kept Sholem's letters to her, and she had also kept her letters to him. And there weren't hundreds of letters, there were 6 letters. But when I was in the library, I thought, maybe I should check, maybe. And I was hesitating, you know, I hadn't been downstairs in a while. I thought maybe no one would remember me. That's my own mishigas. But I finally said, oh, don't be an idiot. You know, you have a half an hour, you better go downstairs. And I went downstairs and I ordered the tik of Sholem's letters. And lo and behold, there was a letter that Dawidowicz had written to him that she hadn't kept a copy of, in which she mentioned reading, she mentioned Hannah Arendt. I mean, it was like gold. It was gold, like the one sentence was gold, because it showed me that she was thinking about Arendt and she didn't write that much about her. But there it was to Sholem. And of course, it was critically important because Sholem broke with Hannah Arendt after Eichmann in Jerusalem, and Lucy Dawidowicz dedicated the war against the Jews, wrote a handwritten copy that you can find in the Sholem Library today in the National Library to Gershom Sholem and Fania. So that showed that he continued a relationship with her when he broke with Arendt, and that was important. I wrote a piece on it. So I hope I answered the methodology question.
And Nancy, there's many questions here from the audience if we want to.
Sorry.
Yeah,
so
no, all good.
About politics, let's just save that to the end, okay? I have such agita.
Yeah, we understand.
Just save that to the end. And Michal, are you gonna? Do you want me to look at the chat?
So let's do. We have a question from Ella, Giovanni, Uri, Catherine, and who is that at the end? Kunzus. I hope I'm pronouncing your name. Yeah. Okay. So maybe Ella, do you want to ask your questions?
ואם אתם רוצים לשאול בעברית ואנחנו יכולים לתרגם, זה בסדר בשבילי.
Ella Alon, yeah. You want to unmute? Okay, I could ask your questions for you if you can't unmute. The question is.
The mic doesn't work.
Okay. How do American New Yiddishists see and remember Lucy S. Dawidowicz today?
Great question. So someone named Hadass Binyamini, maybe she came through your ranks, is now a graduate student at NYU. And she interviewed me for Jewish Currents. So Jewish Currents was, in its day, the English organ of the Jewish section of the Communist Party, okay? So it was called Jewish Life in the 50s, and then it became Jewish Currents. And it was edited for many, many years by someone named Morris Shappies. And if you want to see obedience to the Soviet line, just read Jewish Currents back in the day. But it has morphed, and now it kind of represents kind of the new secular Yiddish inflected small group of wonderful people in New York, in America. So, and Hadass Binyamini did a really wonderful job interviewing me, and she published a transcript. So what I would say is that most people don't know who Lucy Dawidowicz was. Yeah. And if they do, and if they're committed to Yiddish, then they don't like her, because she didn't future for secular Yiddish culture. She thought, and again, this is quite fascinating if you look at her in the book and her relationship to Weinreich and her relationship to Leibish Lehrer. Leibish Lehrer was her mentor at Camp Boiberek and the Shalom Lechem Folk Institute. He was a social psychologist. You know, today when we think of like summer camps or youth groups, we think, it's a bunch of teenagers, you know, with a lot of hormones. But the men and women who ran these camps were like high East European intellectuals. They couldn't get jobs anywhere else, right? You know, the music director like was skilled, you know, was a composer. Leibish Lehrer was a psychologist, and he studied at Clark University, and he wrote a lot on the meaning of myth and ritual for communal cohesion as a psychologist. And he came to the conclusion, even though his whole life, he worked towards Yiddish secular culture as creating an alternate community, for a religious community for Jews. At the end of his life, he came to the conclusion that it wouldn't work, particularly in the United States, where religion and nation are bifurcated, right? Where American Jews are nationally American and they're Jewishly religious or something. And I mean, this has to do with the American experiment, right? It's very different for modern Israeli Jews. It's different for even French Jews today, right? The separation of church and state and the way it plays out. So Leibish Lehrer did not think there was a future for Yiddish culture. Max Weinreich, the most devoted, dogged, secular Yiddishist in the planet, when he wrote his big history, the Geschichte von Jiddische Sprache, he said, Yiddish is born in the civilization of Yiddishkeit, derech hashas, the Talmudic way. Yiddish needs the intersection of religious behavior and Hebrew, etc. Lucy Dawidowicz was very skeptical of Yiddish. And she famously said, reading Peretz does not create a people or a culture. So I would say young Yiddishists, if they read her and if they're determined that Yiddish is the future, they won't like her perspective. And, but she already encountered that pushback in the 70s, you know, so.
Thank you.
I hope I answered that, yeah.
Yeah. Giovanni and then Uri.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your lecture and your insights on this fascinating intellectual. I have a couple of questions about Lucy Dawidowicz's take. You said that she embraced diaspora nationalism and she was communist for a period of her life. Was she involved also in the Birobidzhan debate? Was she a supporter of the Jewish autonomous region? Was she involved in that debate anyhow? And after in the post-Holocaust era, was she involved in what is now called the rebirth of Yiddish culture above all in Poland, with the foundation of the Jewish Historical Institute in 1947, and at least until 1968. And my final question would be her take on American anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was pretty much institutionalized. So what will?
Okay, so first of all, great questions. Birobidzhan is just a blip. I mean, I think in her there's probably like a little mention very early. I'm forgetting by 36, I think the whole experiment is going down the toilet bowl, if my own memory serves. But you know, early on, when she's a communist and she's in the YCL, you know, it would have been rah-rah. But very quickly, Birobidzhan, despite the fact that there's still, the train station still has Yiddish on it and people still some Yiddishists make pilgrimages there. Yael Straw made a film about going there. You know, very quickly, even in its own day, it was never very successful. More successful, you probably know this, are the agricultural settlements in the Crimea, right? Jonathan Deckelhen's book, Farming the Red Land. I mean, those were more successful. So let's just sort of, if you don't mind, let's dispense with Birbija, because there's not that much for me to say. In terms of the post-war issue about Poland, you're asking such a wonderful question. And there is, my book does treat this. Remember, she's an anti-communist and she hates the Soviet Union. And I argue that because of this, and that's a very American view, by the way, but it's also a Jewish socialist view. You know, Zalman Rezin, who was like #2 at the YIVO, is murdered by the Soviets. And Zelig Kalmanovich flees the Soviet Union, and he writes, you know, how he hates the Gedolim, right? He hates the Bolsheviks. So her hatred of the communists is well earned, if you will. And also the social, you know, if you talk to anyone in the Spanish Civil War or socialists in the trade union movement in the United States, the communists were not very nice people. Let's just put it out there. The romance with American communism is a very fraught thing. I will say, if I can, American communists were on the front lines of racial justice before other people. So let's at least throw them a bone. But the issue about Poland is complex for several reasons. First of all, she really cannot stand Christian Poles. You know, she just can't see past the experience of the destruction of Polish Jewish civilization. She can't see past the betrayal of the Polish socialists. The fact that they're, you know, I mean, we could go really down a big rabbit hole now about contemporary Poland, where I spent a lot of time in the last 5-6 years, the kind of emphasis on the righteous Gentiles. But already in 1968, there were debates among intellectuals about how righteous were the righteous Gentiles. You know, there were jokes about, you know, the Warsaw Ghetto Wall was built to keep the righteous Gentiles out. You know, there's all these jokes about this because it's a misreading. Were there righteous Gentiles among Poles? Of course there were. The Jewish community was the largest in the world. Of course there were more Jews saved by Poles than anyone else. But that does not exculpate the deep suspicion of many Jews among many Poles, okay? So there's the problem of her view of Polish agency, of Christian Polish agency. That's A. The other is her experience in the interwar years with hooliganism and the universities. That's 2. And the other is the Cold War context. The Żydowski Instytut Historyczny, like the Bund and like early Jewish revolutionaries in Minsk, is populated by committed Jews, right? People who care about the Jewish future. But they, chameleon-like, have to figure out how to survive. And that means that survival requires enormous skill. And there's some fine work on it, trying to code their commitments in a very safe way. And of course, many people were then, you know, they're banished, exiled, killed. And the best example of the complexity of it is in the figure of Beryl Mark, or Bernard Mark, who was a loyal, at least on the face of it, communist. But and I don't want to get the date wrong, so I will, it's in my book, I should know these things by heart. But at one point, there's a commemoration of the Shoah, or the Warsaw Ghetto in Paris, and Beryl Mark is able to go, and he meets his Israeli compatriots, and who are involved with the Jewish historical institutes in Israel. And he says to them, my life has been a waste. I have been, you know, essentially paying obeisance to a sacred cow. And I wish somehow that I could do right by the history of the Warsaw Ghetto and of my comrades who died. And he single-handedly microfilms materials in the Jewish Historical Institute and gets them to Israel before relations are cut off after the Six-Day War. So she never could see that. She never could absorb all of that. She wasn't reading, you know, the journals in Israel. That the letter is published in, I think, in Golden Kate in the late 70s. So she really can't see with nuance what's going on in the underground communities of Jewish historians, Jewish activists in both the Soviet Union and in the Soviet blocs. And I guess the big question, you know, people always ask me, what would she have said about the Bush Doctrine? And what would she have said about the War on Terror? That interests me less, frankly, than what would she have said about this moment where there's a rebirth quote unquote, not a word I really, but there's a re-encounter by young Poles, both Christian and Jews, with the Polish-Jewish past that was so optimistic after 1991-92, and really has been optimistic and roughly until 2013-14. Now we have a whole different set of issues, but there was a moment of extraordinary, fruitful exchange. And I still have wonderful colleagues in Poland with whom I work, but the climate has changed. But you know, all of the great work that was done by Polish scholars, by German scholars, people who knew Polish, knew Yiddish, knew Hebrew. And Marcin Wojcinski runs the great institute in Wrocław. He spent a lot of time in Israel working with scholars. I mean, I'm going on and on, but all these things are so live for me. My epilogue treats her, if you will, her myopia. I treat that in the epilogue of the book. Thank you for the question.
Great. Yeah, great.
I won't talk about America. Let's move on to something else.
Yeah. So maybe Catherine and then Uri, that was the order of things, or do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my name is Catherine Horrend. I'm working on refugees during the Second World War, and my question relates to some of the historians who criticized her work, particular Raoul Hilberg, but also other historians from Eastern European Jewish studies, concerning that they argue that she's not scientific enough, or that she's not quoting sources on certain subjects that she's speaking about. And I'm interested in what your take is on this and how you interpret this reaction toward her work, and also what that might tell about the divisions within American or the English-speaking Jewish history community, so to say, and also maybe how that influenced her later on in her career and her political outview.
So, fabulous question. Great questions, everyone. So we'll start simply with Hilberg, and I'll try to keep it concise. I see that concision is not my strong suit today, but when you work on a book so long. So when Raoul Hilberg's, she had great regard for Hilberg's book. Let me just start by saying that. As many of you know, it's 5 pages of the book that got him into trouble with certain circles. He got into trouble in the, well, you may know the story, you know, Hannah Arendt was the reader on his book, and she's the one who kind of gave it the kibosh, and Yad Vashem, you know, Ari Dubnov has written about this. I mean, Hilberg was really up against the wall at the time. But Hilberg, as you know, the book is a masterful analysis of the German bureaucracy and death machine. And he has 5, he's not a historian of the Jews, and he works with German sources, not with, you know, Jewish language sources. And he talks about the Jewish response to the Jewish reactions, and he talks about collaboration and complicity and quiescence, and this made her nuts. And they had a very nice correspondence. In fact, at one point she wrote to him and said, you know, your dispassion or your bitterness is getting in the way. You know, you need more life in your work. And I don't have the initial essay that he'd written that he shared with her. My point is that initially they had a good relationship. When his book was reissued and he didn't edit, you know, when you reissue a book, you sometimes have a chance to change things, right? Or edit them, or put a preface that says this was a mistake, you know. You should do that when you reissue a book. I tried to do that in my reissued book with Out of the Shtetl. But he didn't take out those pages. And the distinction between when he first published the book in the 50s and when the book comes out later, which is in the height of the culture wars and the sort of apotheosis of resistance and the condemnation of the Jews for going like sheep to the slaughter, she can't think straight anymore about it. Like, so she goes after him. And then she re-reviews the book in the Washington Post. And then Hilberg, you may have read his memoir, is, how shall I say, a very bitter man at the end of his life. And he goes after 3 women. So you can't help but wonder if there's some male misogyny there. He goes after Nora Levin, who's really just a popularizer, but he goes after Arendt, and he goes after Lucy Dawidowicz. So, you know, the arrows are flung on both sides. In terms of other critiques, let's be clear, she's not, the work that she did today would not be what we would train our students to do. She doesn't get knee deep into certain archives. She didn't have the full language capabilities. You have to put her writing in the perspective of the 70s, you know, where the so-called field was at that moment. And in that regard, she presents a masterful synthesis based on her claims, right? In that I've no quibble. I think, you know, I've read, and you didn't mention, I thought you were going to mention S.L. Schneiderman, Shmuel Leb Schneiderman, an incredibly interesting figure about whom I'm working now, but he attacks her, not as an historian, but as a journalist for, first of all, her work on the book, The Wall by John Hersey, which is a very universalist view of the ghetto revolt. It was an English language novel published in 1950, and she helped Hersey with the translations. So Hersey Schneiderman criticizes that. But then he mostly goes after her for her view of Roosevelt, right? I think this is where we have the difference between on the ground moment of history and then, if you will, retrospective historical judgment. And I think we're all faced with that, right? You know, we don't do journalism, right? We do history, right? We expect a certain amount of time to pass for the dust to settle on the emotions of a moment and then kind of assess. But someone living in the moment doesn't do that. So one of the debates is if you were incarcerated in a ghetto in Europe, you know, what would you have wanted the Americans to do? How would you have viewed that, right? If you were a refugee trying to get to the United States after the war and you were turned back, how would, you know, and you lost family members. I mean, many of us have those stories. And at the moment, you're going to go after people in power. She, with regard to this issue, later on in her life, defended the American government, defended Roosevelt, and went after the Bergson boys, you know, the revisionist Zionists affiliated with Hillel Koch, for their demonstrative militancy during the war, because she believed that the only way to save the Jews was to win the war, and anything that detracted from that was a bad idea. Also, many of you will know that a lot of the resistance to Roosevelt, et cetera, comes rather late because the Americans actually entered the war very late. You know, Americans like to say they won the war. It's a lot of hooey, right? The Soviets fought the war for the most part, and then the Americans entered. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that some of the criticism, and I'd be grateful actually for you to send to me specific criticisms that you think are of value, because it's helpful to me to reassess. But I'm saying that with full, you know, bevakasha, tishlachili. I think some of it is the distinction between the documents of the particular moment and the assessment later. A good example of this is the reaction to the Jewish police. We know the Jewish police were brutal. If you were a member of a family and the Jewish police knocked on your door or barged through your door and took your elderly grandmother, you would hate them. There's no doubt. It would be the absolute appropriate human response. But the question is later then, how do you assess the agency of those policemen and what were their choices? And that's why I brought up the Chernyakov example. Yeah. He killed himself. Was that the right response? So I'll leave my answer there, but I look forward to anything you would send me, really.
Nancy, we have only 1 minute, so maybe we'll end in a more positive note, but the suicide of, of the Judenrat man. Do you want to say maybe just in really 1 minute, what do you think is the most important legacy of Lucy Dawidowicz? Maybe you hinted that towards the end of your lecture.
Well, two things. If there's
in 1 minute, so we'll
okay. First of all, if there's anyone who has a question for me and you want to send me email, I will respond to you. That's a legacy.
What's important? What is important? What is the most important thing?
So I think what I try. Well, okay, it's not really so much what she did, but what I wanted the book to communicate to people is that the history of Jewish politics is not static, and it's historically contingent. And through her life, we can see that. And that was another goal of the book, is that the assumption that the only right Jewish politics is a liberal politics, even if that's where I stand, that's bad. That's not good historiography. That's not that. And you need to have the long view of the Jewish past to understand how Jews as a community have dealt with political agency. And it's not a simple equation of being a liberal. So in that regard, I hope the book linked her life to a much longer tradition of Jewish politics that's more conservative, and that we always have to think historically, what happens at a given moment? You know, what are the historical conditions that produce a certain political response? And there's not one Jewish response. I may not agree with certain people who are flying a certain flag today in this country of mine, but they're not less Jewish than the person who's flying the other flag. And I think that that's, look, in modern Israel, I don't need to tell you, that's one of the challenges.
Great, thank you. That's a great response, and thank you everyone for staying, and thank you for the wonderful talk. Yeah, I know we usually do this on Zoom, but can we actually do this and say thank you to our wonderful guests. Thank you for the time and agreeing to do this on election day. So thank you very much. And Miri,
the more distraction, the merrier.
Yeah, right. Go ahead.
So,
okay, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nancy.
Thank you very much.
We know that you are now rushing to vote, so thank you for making the time.
No, kvar, no.
You're very busy.
Already did. Good. Early.
Okay.
Early and often.
Early and often.
So thank you, everyone. We will meet in 2 weeks' time in our usual slot, Tuesday at 2:15. Thank you, everyone, and stay healthy and safe. Bye.
Yeah. תודה רבה, ביי. להתראות.
Bye.
Bye.